My name is Claire, and I'm in my late 30s. I live an ordinary life by most measures. I'm a wife. Well, I was. A professional. And someone people tend to describe as easygoing, low maintenance, not dramatic. I've been told more than once that I'm strong in a quiet way, usually by people who don't realize how often quiet gets mistaken for passive. If you ask the people around me who I was back then, they might say I was dependable, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who didn't ask for much, the one who handled things so others didn't have to. I learned early how to make myself smaller without disappearing completely. Not because I lacked opinions or awareness, but because I understood how fragile other people's comfort could be. This story isn't about rage. It isn't about revenge. And it definitely isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about observation. It's about what happens when someone assumes your silence means ignorance, when they believe your patience is unlimited, when they think lies can live safely as long as they're spoken softly and repeated often enough. My husband cheated with his coworker and lied for years. Until HR called me, but that isn't the moment the story truly begins. That call came much later, after years of small dismissals, subtle shifts, and things that didn't quite add up if you were paying attention. And I was always paying attention. What I want to be clear about from the beginning is this: I didn't snap. There was no dramatic turning point where I suddenly became someone else. What happened was slower, quieter, almost invisible from the outside. This is a story about emotional justice, not the kind that demands an audience, but the kind that happens when truth finally aligns with reality. It's about psychological reversal, yes, but not through confrontation or humiliation, through patience, through documentation, through letting people reveal exactly who they are when they think no one is watching. I won't spare myself in this story. I stayed longer than I should have. I rationalized things I didn't need to. I benefited from comfort and familiarity, even as cracks formed underneath. This isn't a performance of moral superiority. It's an honest account of how secrets move, how systems protect themselves, and why secrets rarely stay in one place. If you're here because you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or quietly erased while being told you were lucky, you might recognize parts of yourself in what follows. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently, without expectation. Have you ever realized the truth not because someone confessed, but because the silence around them started to feel too carefully managed? For a long time, I was the woman people described using practical language: reliable, low stress, understanding. Those words followed me everywhere: at work, at family gatherings, in conversations my husband had about me when I wasn't in the room. They sounded like compliments, and technically they were, but none of them spoke to who I actually was. They spoke about what I provided. To my husband, I was the steady background, the one who handled logistics so life felt smooth. I remembered which bills were due and when his parents' birthdays were. I noticed when his mood shifted before he did. I absorbed small irritations so evenings stayed calm. He liked to say I was easy to be married to. At the time, I thought that meant loved. To his coworkers, I existed as a concept more than a person. Claire's great, they'd say if my name came up. She's so chill. Sometimes they'd add, "You're lucky she doesn't get jealous." That was usually followed by a laugh, like jealousy was something immature people suffered from, and I had evolved past it. At work, I was the dependable one, the person who could be trusted to notice gaps before they became problems. I wasn't flashy. I didn't speak first in meetings unless I needed to. When I did speak, people listened, but they rarely remembered it was my idea later. I learned that visibility and influence aren't the same thing, and I operated comfortably in the second category. None of this made me unhappy, exactly. It made me useful. And usefulness can feel like safety if you confuse the two long enough. What no one seemed to notice, or maybe they noticed and dismissed, was how much I observed. I remembered exact phrases, not just the tone. I noticed that stories changed slightly over time. I paid attention to patterns, timing, deflection, who laughed too quickly, and who avoided eye contact. I wasn't suspicious by nature. I was attentive. But attentiveness in a woman like me was interpreted as accommodation. If I didn't react strongly, it was because I didn't care. If I didn't ask questions, it was because I trusted completely. If I stayed quiet, it was because I agreed. That assumption became the foundation on which everything else rested. In social settings, I was often physically present, but conversationally optional. People spoke around me, not to me. Decisions were discussed as if I'd naturally support whatever outcome was chosen. And most of the time, I did, because it wasn't worth disrupting the equilibrium over something small. I didn't demand emotional labor from others. I didn't test loyalty. I didn't ask for reassurance. I thought that made me mature. Looking back, I can see how easily that maturity was mistaken for absence. My husband never worried about what I might do if I were hurt. He worried about being caught, sure, but not about my response. In his mind, I was consistent, predictable, safe. I was the person who would process things privately and move on quietly, because that's what I had always done. Even I believe that about myself. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being competent and calm. You don't trigger concern. You don't invite scrutiny. People assume that if something were wrong, you would say so. And when you don't, they take your silence as proof that everything is fine. What they didn't understand was that silence had never meant I wasn't registering what was happening. It only meant I was choosing when and whether it deserved a response. At that stage of my life, I still believed most situations resolve themselves if you gave them enough time and goodwill. I believe that clarity eventually emerged on its own. I believed love, once established, naturally protected itself. Those beliefs weren't foolish. They were incomplete. I was fully present in my life, but no one, including the person sleeping beside me, understood how much I was storing away. Not resentment, not anger, information. And information doesn't announce itself. It waits. At the time, though, I didn't think of myself as someone powerful. I thought of myself as someone reasonable, someone flexible, someone who didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room to matter. I didn't yet understand that being underestimated wasn't a personality trait. It was a position others assigned me. And positions can change. The first time something felt wrong, it was almost nothing. So small, in fact, that I nearly forgot it myself. We were at a casual work gathering, one of those after-hours drinks that blur the line between professional and personal just enough to make everyone feel relaxed. I had stopped by after finishing late at my own office. My husband was already there, standing near the bar with a group of his coworkers. Laughter floated easily around him. He looked comfortable, confident. When I joined them, he introduced me, not by name at first, but by role. "This is my wife," he said, hand resting briefly at my back. Then almost immediately, He turned away to continue the story he'd been telling. It wasn't rude in any obvious way. No one flinched. No one reacted. But something in me registered the timing. The way the introduction functioned was less as an invitation and more as a formality. I stood there smiling politely while the conversation flowed back to where it had been, as if I were a pause rather than a participant. A woman I didn't know well, one of his coworkers, glanced at me and smiled. It was friendly but quick. Her attention returned to him almost instantly. Later, when we were driving home, I mentioned it casually. I felt a little invisible back there, I said, keeping my tone light. Observational, not accusatory. He laughed just slightly. You're overthinking it. Everyone was just tipsy. That was the first small cut, not because of what happened, but because of how efficiently it was dismissed. There was no curiosity, no follow-up, no, oh, I didn't realize, are you okay? Just a gentle wave of the hand over my perception, like smoothing a wrinkle that didn't need to be examined. I let it go, or at least, I told myself I did, but I remembered it. After that, similar moments appeared, not frequently enough to form a pattern yet, but close enough together that they felt related. He'd mention a coworker's name more often than others, always in passing, always neutrally. He'd laugh at his phone and tilt the screen away slightly when I looked over, not dramatically, just instinctively, like someone protecting a joke rather than a secret. Once I asked who he was texting so late. Work stuff, he said easily, too easily. And when I asked a follow-up question, he sighed, just enough to signal that I was edging toward inconvenience. I backed off, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I was trying to be the version of myself everyone seemed to appreciate. The calm one, the reasonable one, the woman who didn't read into things. Other people noticed things too, but only in fragments. A friend commented once, "He seems really energized lately." My mother asked, "Is he under a lot of pressure at work?" No one framed these observations as concerns. They were neutral statements, floating impressions. And I treated them the same way, filed but not acted upon. The truth is, nothing in those early days felt actionable. There was no clear betrayal, no evidence, just a subtle reorientation of his attention that left me standing slightly off-center in my own marriage. And that's the danger of small cuts. They don't bleed, they don't demand care, they just hurt quietly and heal wrong. What stayed with me wasn't the coworker. It wasn't even his behavior in isolation. It was the way my reality became negotiable the moment I voiced it. I learned in that moment that my role wasn't to observe. It was to absorb, to take in discomfort and release reassurance, to notice, but not name, to feel, but not disrupt. And I played that role well, because I had been trained to. But even as I smiled and moved on, something shifted internally. Not anger, not suspicion, attention. I began listening more closely, not just to what he said, but to how quickly he said it, to which details came pre-packaged, and which ones emerged only when prompted. I noticed that when explanations felt rehearsed rather than recalled, I didn't confront him. I didn't check his phone. I didn't confide in friends. I simply remembered, because the first small cut teaches you something important if you're willing to learn it. Pain doesn't always announce itself loudly, and neither does truth. Sometimes it whispers once, just to see if you're paying attention. I was. Once something happens twice, it stops feeling like an anomaly. It starts to feel like context. After that first quiet dismissal, similar moments began to stack on top of one another. Not dramatically, not in a way that forced immediate reckoning. They arrived gently, almost politely, which made them easier to excuse. He began working later more often, not every night, just enough that it felt plausible. When I asked how his day was, the answers became broader, less textured. Busy, long, same old stuff. If I asked a follow-up, he'd respond, but with a tone that suggested I was requesting extra labor from him. As if detail itself were indulgent, I adjusted. I told myself I didn't need to know everything, that privacy was healthy, that not every change signaled danger. These were reasonable thoughts. They were also convenient. When we went out together, I noticed how easily he drifted away from me in group settings. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but decisively. He didn't check to see if I was following. He assumed I would be fine, and I usually was. There were moments when his phone would light up on the table, and he'd turn it face down without thinking, not hiding it, just managing it. When I pointed it out once, gently, he smiled and said, "You're really fixated on my phone lately." I wasn't, but I heard the implication. Fixation implied irrationality, insecurity, a problem that lived in me rather than in the space between us. So I recalibrated again. I stopped asking follow-up questions. I stopped mentioning when something felt off. I told myself I was being mature, trusting, evolved past the need for constant reassurance, and on the surface that was true. I wasn't consumed by fear. I wasn't losing sleep. But I was adjusting my expectations downward in quiet increments. Each time something didn't sit right, I offered myself a narrative that preserved harmony. He's under stress. Work is demanding right now. I don't want to be the kind of partner who nags. If something were really wrong, I'd know. That last one was the most dangerous, because part of me already knew something was wrong. I just didn't yet have language for it. The disrespect wasn't loud. It didn't arrive in the form of insults or neglect. It lived in the space where my perspective should have mattered and didn't, in how quickly my discomfort was smoothed over rather than explored, how often was expected to adapt rather than be met halfway. And because I was good at adapting, it worked. I became easier to overlook because I made it easy. At work, this pattern mirrored itself in smaller ways. Ideas I contributed were implemented without acknowledgement. Decisions were made that affected my responsibilities without consultation. When I pointed this out once, a manager said, "You're so flexible. I figured you'd be okay with it." I was praised for the very thing that erased me. So when my husband dismissed my perceptions, it didn't register as alarming. It registered as familiar. I had internalized the idea that my role was to maintain stability, not to interrogate it. There was also fear, if I'm being honest. Not fear of him leaving, exactly, but fear of what naming the problem might require of me. Confrontation would mean clarity, and clarity would demand change. I wasn't sure yet if I wanted that, so I normalized the disrespect. I told myself this was what long-term relationships looked like, that passion settled, that attention shifted, that asking for more would be unrealistic, maybe even selfish. And to his credit, he wasn't cruel. He wasn't overtly dismissive. He still showed up, still shared meals, still laughed with me. That made it harder, because when betrayal doesn't announce itself, you begin to doubt your own calibration. You wonder if you're searching for something that isn't there. You question whether your sensitivity is the problem. I wasn't angry. I was accommodating. But accommodation, when it only flows in one direction, slowly becomes consent. And without realizing it, I was consenting to being less considered, less included, less central in my own marriage. The thing about normalizing disrespect is that it doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like a compromise. It feels adult, reasonable. It feels like love until one day it doesn't. That day hadn't arrived yet, but it was moving closer, quietly, every time I chose peace over precision. And still, I said nothing, because silence had become my default. And defaults are hard to challenge until they stop working. Roles don't always get announced. Sometimes they settle over you slowly, like a coat someone drapes across your shoulders without asking. You wear it because it's already there, because removing it would require explanation, and because everyone else seems comfortable with you in it. I realized my role one evening while we were hosting friends for dinner. It was nothing special, just a casual gathering. I cooked, as I usually did. He handled the music and drinks. People filled our living room with easy conversation. At some point, someone asked him how work was going. He launched into a story, animated, detailed, energized, in a way I hadn't seen in months. He spoke about a project, about collaboration, about how they had really pulled it off as a team. I noticed the way his voice shifted when he mentioned one coworker in particular, just a fraction warmer, more engaged. No one else noticed it, or if they didn't register it as meaningful. I did. As he talked, I moved through the room refilling glasses, clearing plates, smoothing things over. At one point, a friend turned to me and said, "You're such a good sport. You always make this stuff look easy." I smiled and thanked her. That was my role, the good sport, the supporter, the woman who made things easier for everyone else. No one asked if I wanted that role. It was assigned to me through repetition and reinforced through praise. Even my husband participated in it unconsciously. When someone complimented the meal, he said, "She's amazing, right?" Not that she's talented or that she loves cooking, just amazing in the way a system is amazing when it works without supervision. Later that night, after everyone left, I said something mild. "You seemed really happy tonight." "I was," he replied, not defensively, just honestly. "With them?" I asked. He shrugged. "Work has been exciting lately." There it was again, that subtle redirection. My question wasn't answered so much as bypassed. And once more, I let it go because the role I was assigned didn't include pushing. It included understanding. It included patience. It included being the emotional adult in the room. I began to see how consistently that role showed up. If something went wrong, I was expected to absorb the inconvenience. If plans changed, I was expected to adjust. If someone else was stressed, I was expected to be calm. I was the reliable constant in a system that was quietly rearranging itself around me. And here's the part that's uncomfortable to admit. I played that role well because it made me feel necessary, needed, central in a way that didn't require visibility. Being the dependable one gave me identity. It gave me worth that wasn't threatened by competition, but it also made me predictable. My husband didn't worry about my reaction because he believed he already knew it. I would be reasonable. I would be composed. I would not blow things up. I would, above all else, keep things functioning. He wasn't entirely wrong. The problem with roles is that they don't adapt when circumstances change. They persist, even when they no longer fit. And the longer you inhabit one, the more resistance you face when you try to step outside it. I hadn't yet tried to step outside mine, but I was beginning to feel its edges. I noticed how often decisions were made with the assumption that I'd be fine, that my needs were flexible, negotiable, secondary, not because anyone disliked me, but because the system had learned I wouldn't object, and systems learn quickly. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. I wasn't being mistreated in a way that demanded immediate escape. I was being managed. placed carefully into a role that kept everything else running smoothly, including the parts of my husband's life that no longer centered me. Understanding that didn't change anything overnight, but it did something more important. It made me stop seeing these moments as isolated incidents. They were structural, predictable, logical even. Once you understand the role you've been assigned, you also understand how people will behave if you continue to play it. And for the first time, I began to wonder what would happen if I didn't. The shift didn't happen during a fight. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic discovery. It happened on a weekday afternoon, in the most unremarkable way possible, through an email that wasn't meant for me. I was working from home that day, sitting at the dining table with my laptop open. His computer was on the desk in the spare room where he'd left it that morning. He'd asked me to forward something if a package arrived. That was normal. We shared access to things. There had never been a reason not to. When I opened his laptop, the email client was already open. I wasn't looking for anything. I didn't scroll. I didn't search. My eyes landed on a subject line that hadn't been there before. Glad we talked today. That was all. No names visible. No obvious red flags. Just familiarity. Intimacy implied through tone rather than content. I stared at it longer than I needed to. There was a time when I might have opened it immediately. Another time when I might have closed the laptop and told myself it was nothing. That day, I did neither. I simply noted it. The shift wasn't suspicion, it was restraint. Something in me settled, like a piece clicking into place. I realized I didn't need answers right now. I didn't need to confront. I didn't even need to confirm what I already suspected. I needed context. So I forwarded the package notification, closed the laptop, and went back to my work. But the way I paid attention changed. Not sharper, more patient. That evening, he came home in a good mood, relaxed. He kissed my cheek and asked about my day. I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't mention the email. I didn't watch his face for tells. I watched patterns instead. I noticed how he avoided his laptop after dinner, opting for his phone instead. He seemed distracted, but not anxious. How the distance between us felt maintained rather than accidental. And I understood something quietly, but clearly. Whatever was happening wasn't chaotic. It was managed. That realization mattered more than the content of any message could have. From that point on, I stopped reacting emotionally to new information. Not because I was numb, but because I recognized that reaction would cost me clarity. I began separating what I felt from what I knew. What I felt was sadness, confusion, a dull ache of being displaced. What I knew was that I had time. The story wasn't finished yet. I didn't check his email again. I didn't follow up on that subject line. Instead, I paid attention to frequency, to timing, to his energy before and after work, to how often certain names surfaced in conversation and how often they didn't. I noticed how careful he was becoming with details. Not secretive, selective. There's a difference. Secretive people hide. Selective people curate. That's when I understood that confronting him would only prompt better curation. And I wasn't interested in a performance. I wasn't angry enough to explode. I wasn't desperate enough to plead. I wasn't afraid enough to rush. The day something shifted was the day I realized I didn't need to be anything for him anymore. Not the supporter, not the good sport, not the stabilizer. I needed to be accurate. Accuracy requires patience. So I stayed quiet, not in denial, not in fear, but in deliberate observation. I let things continue as they were, because I wanted to see how far they'd go when they believed they were unobserved. This wasn't a test. It was a study. And the most important change wasn't in my behavior. It was in my identity. I stopped seeing myself as someone waiting for truth to arrive. I became someone capable of uncovering it, calmly, methodically, without rushing the outcome. That day, nothing outwardly changed. We ate dinner, we talked about weekend plans, we went to bed at the same time, but internally, I crossed a line I would never step back over. I stopped needing reassurance. And once that happens, you stop being predictable. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been habitual, a reflex shaped by years of choosing harmony over friction. Now it was deliberate. I wasn't withholding words because I didn't have them. I was withholding them because I understood their weight. And that difference mattered. I stopped asking questions that would force him to lie to me directly. Not because I feared the lie, but because lies, when unprompted, reveal far more over time. People who think they're safe tend to relax. They fill the silence with assumptions. They get careless with consistency. He mistook my quiet for acceptance in a way that was understandable. Nothing about my behavior signaled alarm. I still cooked, still listened, still showed up to events when expected. If anything, I became easier, less curious, less engaged in the details of his day. That ease reassured him. I could see it in how his posture softened around me, how his explanations grew shorter, how he stopped preemptively justifying things. He believed the system was stable again. At work, I mirrored this approach without consciously planning to. I stopped offering solutions unless directly asked. I documented interactions rather than reacting to them. I paid attention to how decisions were communicated and how often they weren't. I was collecting context in parallel worlds. The silence gave me space. And in that space, I noticed things that emotional turbulence would have obscured. I noticed that certain evenings followed predictable patterns: late arrival, shower first, phone face down, minimal conversation. I noticed that his irritation surfaced not when I asked questions, but when plans disrupted his schedule unexpectedly. That told me where his priorities lived. I also noticed how others responded to my quiet. Friends stopped checking in as often. The family assumed everything was fine. When people did ask how we were doing, my neutral answers satisfied them. No one pushed. Silence is socially contagious. When you don't signal urgency, others don't feel obligated to investigate. That worked in my favor. I began to see how often women are trained to narrate their pain in real time, to justify it, explain it, soften it so it can be received. I opted out of that process. I didn't need witnesses. I needed leverage. And leverage doesn't announce itself. He began making small mistakes, not moral ones, but logistical ones. Mentioning meetings that didn't align with his calendar. Referring to conversations he hadn't told me about yet. Forgetting which version of a story he'd shared. Each mistake was minor, individually meaningless, together informative. I wrote nothing down at first. I let it live in my memory. I wanted to be sure I wasn't projecting patterns where none existed. But the repetition continued. So eventually, quietly, I started documenting. Dates, times, phrases. Not emotionally, factually, like a researcher recording observations without commentary. This wasn't about catching him. It was about understanding the structure he was operating within. I realized then that silence is often mistaken for weakness because it denies others' feedback. People rely on reaction to calibrate their behavior. When you stop reacting, they assume compliance. They rarely consider strategy. He grew more confident, Not bolder, more comfortable. That comfort showed in how little he checked in, how he assumed availability, how he planned without consultation. I allowed it because I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing for clarity. There's a particular power in being underestimated when you are no longer emotionally invested in maintaining the illusion others rely on. My silence didn't mean I was waiting. It meant I was ready to let the truth finish revealing itself. And it did. Slowly, methodically, without needing my interference. At that point, I understood something fundamental. I didn't need him to confess. I didn't need proof to feel justified. What I needed was a complete picture, one that didn't rely on his narrative at all. Silence gave me that. And the longer it lasted, the more irreversible my understanding became. What they never noticed was how much room their confidence gave me. When people believe you're no longer paying attention, they stop editing themselves. They assume the story they've told you has settled into place, that it no longer needs maintenance. That assumption creates gaps, small ones at first, then wider. I moved through those gaps quietly. By then, documenting had become a habit, not an obsession. I didn't write every detail, only the ones that repeated. Patterns matter more than incidents. Anyone can explain away one late night, one strange message, one shift in tone. Patterns don't need interpretation. They speak for themselves. I noticed how often his team dinners fell on the same nights of the week, how travel plans changed last minute, but always landed within the same narrow window. I noticed which names were absent from stories rather than present. Omission, I learned, was more revealing than emphasis. I also began paying attention to systems, because people operate within systems, and systems leave traces, expense reports, calendar syncs, corporate policies he'd casually complain about over dinner. I listened more carefully when he talked about HR, not defensively, just with a kind of practiced ease, like someone who knew where the lines were and believed he was nowhere near crossing them. That belief was important. At work, my own positioning shifted subtly. I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. I volunteered for projects that gave me access rather than visibility. I reconnected with colleagues in compliance-adjacent roles, not to ask questions, just to maintain relationships. I updated my resume quietly and didn't send it anywhere. Preparation isn't panic, it's optionality. I also began separating my financial life from our shared assumptions. Nothing dramatic, just awareness. I made sure I understood every account, every recurring payment, every policy. I knew where documents were stored and which ones only existed digitally. Knowledge has weight. I wanted to carry my own. At home, nothing looked different. That was the part that mattered most. I still laughed at the right moments. I still showed up to family functions. I still asked about his day, just not in ways that invited elaboration. My calm wasn't an act. It was the byproduct of no longer needing reassurance from someone whose truth I didn't trust. What they never noticed was that my emotional energy had shifted away from maintenance and toward analysis. I stopped asking why and started asking how. How did he manage his time so precisely? How did he compartmentalize so cleanly? How did the people around him participate, knowingly or not, in protecting that compartment? The answers didn't come all at once. They layered. One evening, he mentioned a new internal policy change at work. The way he described it was casual, but slightly off. I looked it up later, not because I suspected anything specific, but because I wanted context. The policy had been implemented months earlier. That told me something. Not that he was lying, but that he was choosing what version of reality to share. Another time, I noticed a name appear on a document he'd left open briefly. A name I'd heard before, always in passing, always neutrally. This time, the context was different. Structural, formal. I didn't react. I didn't ask. I cross-referenced later. The picture forming wasn't emotional, it was logistical. Timelines aligned, access overlapped, reporting structures intersected in ways that made certain risks obvious. What they never noticed was that I wasn't looking for betrayal in the romantic sense. I was looking for exposure, and exposure depends on the process. I began to understand that whatever was happening wasn't reckless. It was calculated enough to feel safe, but not careful enough to be invisible to someone who understood systems. That someone was me. I also noticed how often people underestimated my understanding of his professional world. They spoke freely around me, assuming I wasn't tracking details. That assumption created more gaps. I stepped into those gaps without announcing myself. There was no thrill in this, no satisfaction, just a growing sense of inevitability. Once you see how something works, you stop being surprised by it. I wasn't preparing to confront him. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to choose, without pressure, without urgency, without needing his cooperation. That's what they never noticed. They thought my silence meant stability. They thought my calm meant contentment. They thought my lack of questions meant trust. In reality, it meant I had moved into a position where I no longer needed permission to understand the truth. And once you reach that position, everything else becomes a matter of timing. The reveal didn't arrive with a surge of adrenaline. There was no sharp inhale, no racing heart, no moment where the world tilted and I had to steady myself against a wall. When it finally became clear, undeniably, structurally clear, I felt something closer to stillness. Clarity has a temperature, and this one was cool. I was reviewing documents late one evening. Not his, mine. Old emails, saved files, things I hadn't looked at in years. I wasn't searching for evidence. I was organizing, preparing my own records in case I needed them later. That's when I noticed the overlap. Two timelines that shouldn't have intersected did. A project date he'd mentioned casually. A policy update I'd already researched. A name that appeared again, this time attached to a departmental change. Individually, they were harmless. Together, they formed a configuration that corporate systems don't ignore. I remember closing my laptop and sitting there for a moment, hands folded, breathing evenly. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I understood exactly what I was looking at. This wasn't just an affair, it was an exposure point. Whatever emotional story he had built about connection, stress, mutual understanding was irrelevant. What mattered was structure, reporting lines, policy language, the kind of rules that don't care about intent. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry. I felt finished with uncertainty. The leverage wasn't something I could use emotionally. It wasn't a secret I could throw at him in an argument. It was something quieter, heavier, and far more consequential. I didn't tell anyone, not a friend, not a family member, not even myself, out loud. I let it settle. That night, he came home late, later than usual. He was tired, distracted, comfortable in the way people are when they believe their reality is intact. He kissed my cheek, asked about dinner, and talked about work in broad strokes. I listened, and for the first time, I heard his words as narrative, not truth. That distinction changed everything. I realized then that I no longer needed to prove anything. Not to him, not to myself. The private reveal wasn't about discovery. It was about alignment. Everything I'd noticed, Every small inconsistency, every dismissed perception, it all fit. The picture was complete. I slept well that night, not because I was at peace, but because my mind was no longer searching. Over the next few days, I verified what I already knew, not obsessively, just enough to be certain. I didn't access anything I wasn't allowed to. I didn't cross lines. I simply confirmed publicly available structures and timelines. The system did the rest. What struck me most was how fragile his confidence suddenly looked from the outside. Not weak, just dependent. Dependent on silence, on assumption, on my continued participation in a version of reality that benefited him. And I understood something important. Leverage isn't power unless you choose to use it. Knowing you have it is enough to change how you stand in the room. I didn't confront him because there was nothing left to ask. I didn't feel the urge to hear his explanation. Explanations are designed to preserve self-image. They rarely illuminate truth. Instead, I began to consider my options, not emotionally, but ethically. What did I owe him? What did I owe myself? What did I owe the version of me who had been so carefully underestimated? The answer to the last question mattered most. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want spectacles. I didn't want to watch him panic or scramble or rewrite history in my presence. I wanted accuracy. And accuracy meant choosing a path that didn't rely on his cooperation or awareness. The private reveal gave me that freedom. From that moment on, I moved differently, not dramatically, decisively. My posture changed, my attention narrowed. I stopped performing normalcy for his comfort and started conserving energy for my own decisions. He noticed something was different, but misread it. "You've been really calm lately," he said one evening, like lighter. I smiled. "I am," and I meant it. Because clarity, once it arrives, lifts a weight you didn't realize you were carrying. I wasn't excited. I wasn't relieved. I was resolved. The story had reached a point where it no longer needed emotion to move forward. Only choice. Once you have clarity, you don't rush. That surprised me most. I had always assumed that if I ever truly knew, not suspected, not wondered, but knew, I would act immediately. That there would be a confrontation, a breaking point, some decisive emotional release. Instead, I paused, not because I was afraid, but because I finally had options. And when you have options, haste is a luxury you no longer need. I laid them out quietly, one by one. I could confront him privately, tell him what I know, watch him scramble for language that preserved his dignity while erasing my experience. That path would give me answers, maybe even apologies, but it would also give him control over the narrative. He would frame the story as a mistake, a misunderstanding, a moment of weakness, and I would be positioned as the one who decided how much forgiveness was appropriate. I didn't want that role. I could leave without explanation, disappear from the marriage with my clarity intact, and let him piece together the reasons on his own. That path appealed to my desire for autonomy, but it would also leave loose ends, practical ones, legal ones, and it would require me to carry the full weight of the truth alone, indefinitely. I didn't want silence to become erasure. I could do nothing. Stay. Continue as we were. Use my knowledge as quiet insulation and let time dull the sharpness of what I knew. That was the easiest option, and the most corrosive. It would require me to split myself, to live beside someone while withholding a reality that defined our relationship. I had already done enough of that. The final option was the one I didn't consider at first, because it felt impersonal, systemic. I could let the truth surface through the structure it had violated, not as punishment, not as exposure for its own sake, but as a consequence. This option didn't center my emotions. It didn't require me to perform pain or forgiveness. It didn't ask me to manage his reaction or protect his self-image. It simply allowed reality to interact with policy. That was the irreversible choice. Because once you step outside the interpersonal and into the systemic, there's no way back to private negotiation. No opportunity to reframe. No space for selective memory. I sat with that understanding for several days. I watched him move through our home, comfortable in assumptions I no longer shared. I listened to him talk about work, about plans, about the future, always inclusive in language, never in substance. I felt no urge to interrupt him. The decision wasn't driven by anger, it was driven by alignment. I asked myself one final question, not about him, but about me. What choice allows me to remain honest without becoming cruel? The answer was clear. I wasn't going to confront him first. I wasn't going to warn him. I wasn't going to manage the fallout on his behalf. I would step out of the way and let the structure he trusted do what it was designed to do. That decision closed something inside me, not my heart, my hesitation. From that point on, everything became logistical. Timing, sequence, documentation. I moved with intention, but without urgency. There was no countdown, no dramatic moment circled on a calendar. I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady. He sensed the shift, though he couldn't name it. He asked if everything was okay more than once. I answered honestly. Yes, I said, I'm okay. And I was, because the hardest part wasn't choosing what to do. It was choosing not to explain myself to someone who had spent years explaining me away. Once that choice was made, there was no path back to ambiguity, only follow through. After the decision, life became strangely quiet. Not externally, nothing changed there. We still woke up at the same time, still discussed groceries, still shared space in ways that would have looked, to anyone else, completely ordinary. Internally, though, everything had already shifted. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about efficiency. I began by organizing what I already had, not hunting for more, not digging deeper, just consolidating. Documents, dates, my own records. I made sure everything was accessible, duplicated, and stored somewhere that wasn't shared. Not because I expected retaliation, but because clarity deserves protection. I also took a careful look at my finances, not with panic, with precision. I verified balances. I listed obligations. I reviewed insurance, benefits, and joint accounts. I noted what was tied to his employment and what wasn't. I didn't move money. I didn't change passwords. I didn't leave traces of alarm. Preparation doesn't need to announce itself. At work, I scheduled meetings I'd been meaning to have for months. Not about him, about me. I asked about growth paths, contingencies, and mobility. I gathered information the way I always had, calmly, professionally, without tipping my hand. No one suspected anything because there was nothing to suspect. At home, I became even more neutral, not colder, lighter, less invested in managing mood, less responsive to subtle bids for reassurance. I didn't withdraw affection dramatically, I simply stopped compensating. He interpreted this as stability. You seem really grounded lately, he said one night. I like this version of you. I nodded. Me too. What he didn't notice was that I had stopped anchoring my sense of safety to his behavior. My calm no longer depended on his consistency. That made me unpredictable in a way he couldn't detect. I also did something I hadn't done in years. I imagined my life without editing it for someone else's comfort. I didn't plan emotionally. I planned practically. where I would live, what I would need, what I could carry forward, and what I would leave behind. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It felt adult. The silence worked because I wasn't acting against him. I was acting for myself. That distinction kept my choices clean. When I finally engaged the structure I had identified, I did so without ceremony. No announcement, no preamble, just accuracy, submitted through the appropriate channel, with no embellishment. I didn't include feelings. I didn't include speculation. I included facts. That was enough. After that, there was nothing more for me to do but wait. Not anxiously, not expectantly, just patiently. Systems move at their own pace. They don't respond to urgency. They respond to thresholds. And I had crossed one. In the meantime, life continued as usual. He complained about work one evening, mildly irritated. I listened without reacting. Another night, he talked about future plans, vacations, possibilities. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. Those conversations didn't hurt the way they might have earlier, because I wasn't living in the future he imagined anymore. The strange thing about moving in silence is that it doesn't feel like hiding. It feels like stepping into a different room while the noise continues elsewhere. I slept well. I ate normally. I functioned. And no one, not my husband, not our friends, not our families, noticed that anything had changed. Which was exactly the point, because the consequences, when they arrived, wouldn't need my voice to announce them. They would speak for themselves. The first consequence didn't look like a consequence at all. It arrived in confusion. He came home earlier than usual one afternoon, his movements slightly off, key placing things too loudly on the counter, shoes kicked off without their usual care. He didn't say anything right away, just stood in the kitchen, staring at nothing, as if he were trying to remember why he'd walked into the room. "Everything okay?" I asked evenly. "Yeah," he said, then paused. "Actually, work was weird today." We sat at the table. He talked in fragments. A meeting that had been rescheduled without explanation. A request for documentation that felt unnecessary. A tone shift from a supervisor who had always been friendly. "They're probably just tightening procedures," he concluded, trying to sound unconcerned. I nodded. "That happens." What struck me wasn't his worry. It was his surprise. He hadn't anticipated friction. He'd believed the structure he operated within was neutral terrain. That belief was beginning to erode. Over the next week, the friction increased. Emails went unanswered longer than usual. Calendar access changed. He mentioned being looped out of conversations he'd previously led. None of it was dramatic. None of it was accusatory. It was simply exclusion. And exclusion, when you're used to inclusion, feels like loss even before you understand why. He became restless, irritable in small ways. He asked more questions at home, not about me, but about logistics, schedules, availability, my plans. It felt like recalibration, like someone checking whether the ground beneath them was still where they left it. Friends noticed his mood before they noticed mine. "He seems stressed," someone said to me casually. "Everything okay with work?" I smiled. "He's figuring things out." Which was true. What fascinated me was how quickly the narrative shifted around him. People who had once deferred now hedged. Conversations became more formal. The easy confidence he carried began to look premature. At home, he oscillated between reassurance and irritation. "I think they're overreacting," he said one night. "They can't seriously think—" He stopped himself. "I've done nothing wrong." I didn't ask what he meant. That silence forced him to sit with his own words. Without my reaction to anchor him, his statements floated, unresolved. He wasn't being accused. He was being assessed. And that difference mattered. The consequences weren't loud. They were administrative, structural, the kind that don't invite defense because they don't require blame. He started sleeping poorly, waking early, checking his phone compulsively, not to hide it anymore, but because it had become a lifeline. One evening he asked, "If something happened at work, we'd be okay, right?" I looked at him for a moment, not searching his face, recognizing it. "We'd figure things out," I said. That answer unsettled him more than reassurance would have, because it didn't confirm permanence. I watched him move through the house differently now, less assured, more cautious. He closed doors he used to leave open. He hesitated before speaking. He was trying to locate the point at which control had slipped away. What he didn't understand was that control hadn't been taken, it had been released. The system was doing what systems do when they detect misalignment. It was a narrowing option, slowing movement, requiring explanation without accusation. And the people around him felt it too. The tone of the invitations changed. Conversations became careful. He was still included, but conditionally. The ease was gone. No one knew why. Not exactly. And that uncertainty did something powerful. It isolated him without making him a victim. At home, our dynamic shifted subtly. He needed reassurance. I no longer offer it automatically, not as punishment, just as reality. Reassurance requires belief, and belief requires trust. I wasn't angry. I was absent in a way he couldn't confront. The consequences had begun, and they didn't need my voice to carry them forward. They moved through channels he respected, structures he relied on, and identities he had invested in. And for the first time, he was the one being observed. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, he had already missed the window to fix it. That's the thing about systems. They don't respond to intent. They respond to the sequence. And once a sequence passes a certain point, no amount of explanation can pull it back. He didn't come home angry that night. He came home quietly, not the thoughtful quiet I had grown into, but a brittle one, the kind that comes from rehearsing conversations that didn't go as planned. He set his bag down slowly, as the weight of it had increased without warning. "They're opening a review," he said finally. "I didn't ask what kind. They won't tell me who said what," he continued, pacing. "They won't even say if it's about me directly. It's all procedural." Procedural. The word landed exactly where it was supposed to. I watched him try to make sense of it, cycling through theories, scanning his memory for moments he could reframe, conversations he could reinterpret. He wanted a mistake he could correct, a misunderstanding he could clarify. What he had instead was a process. Over the next few days, his panic sharpened. He called people he hadn't spoken to in months, sent emails he'd never have sent before. Careful, deferential, searching for reassurance without asking for it outright. Some replied politely, some didn't. Each non-response tightened something in him. At home, he became almost attentive, asked how I was feeling, suggested dinners, mentioned trips we might take once this work thing is settled down. He was trying to stabilize something, but he didn't know what had destabilized it. At one point, he said, "If I messed up somewhere, I just want the chance to make it right." I looked at him then, really looked. "I believe you," I said. And I did. About that part, he wanted to fix things. He just didn't understand that the thing he needed to fix was no longer accessible to him. The irony was painful, but not in the way people expect. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt distant, like watching a storm through glass. He began asking questions, not accusatory ones, but anxious ones. "Have I ever talked about work in a way that bothered you? Did anything ever seem off to you?" These questions came too late. Not because I was withholding information, but because the moment where my answers could have altered his behavior had already passed. Truth doesn't rewind. I answered honestly, but minimally. I noticed things, I said once, but I trusted you to manage them. That sentence stayed with him. I could see it in the way he repeated it to himself later, quietly as if testing its meaning. He wanted to know what I knew. How long have I known it? Whether I had played a role? I didn't volunteer that information, not because I was protecting Malv, but because it no longer served any purpose. The review accelerated. Meetings became formal. Language tightened. He was advised to consult counsel. That word, counsel, changed the temperature of everything. He stopped sleeping, stopped pretending this would blow over. The narrative he had relied on, that he was careful, that he was in control, collapsed under scrutiny. One night, he said, almost to himself, I should have handled this differently. He didn't specify what this was. That was telling. Regret, when it finally arrived, didn't look like remorse. It looked like disorientation, like realizing the map you'd been following no longer matched the terrain. He tried to fix it through proximity, staying close to me, seeking comfort, anchoring himself to the version of life that had once felt secure. I let him, but I didn't merge with that need, because this wasn't about punishment. It was about consequence. And consequences don't negotiate once they've been set in motion. The moment he asked, do you think this will change things between us? I knew he understood, on some level, that the damage wasn't confined to work. Yes, I said calmly, it already has. There was nothing left to undo, only to face. The confrontation didn't happen when everything came out. It happened when everything was already known. By then, the air between us had changed. Not tense, thin, like something essential had been removed, and neither of us was pretending otherwise. It was a quiet Sunday morning. No urgency, no raised voices. Just the two of us at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, the house unusually still. He spoke first. I need to ask you something, he said. His voice was careful, stripped of confidence. I waited. How long have you known? I didn't ask what he meant. Long enough, I said. That answer landed without drama. He nodded slowly, as if he'd been preparing himself for it. Why didn't you say anything, he asked. This was the question he'd been building toward, the one he believed would reveal something about me. Anger, strategy, betrayal. I answered simply, because you weren't listening when I did. That was true. And because it was true, it didn't need emphasis. He looked down at his hands. I would have stopped. I know, I said. That surprised him. You know? Yes. Because this wasn't about whether he could stop. It was about the fact that he hadn't needed to, until consequences appeared. I didn't want to manage your behavior, I continued. I wanted to understand it. There was no accusation in my voice, just a fact. He exhaled slowly. Was any of this intentional? He was asking if I had orchestrated the collapse, if I had set traps, if I had waited for the worst moment to strike. No, I said. I didn't create anything, I just stopped preventing it. That was the truth. For a long time, my role had been to smooth over discomfort, absorb tension, and protect the illusion of stability. When I stepped out of that role, the system recalibrated on its own. He sat with that. I never thought you'd do something like this, he said quietly. I met his eyes. You never thought I would do anything at all. That wasn't said with bitterness, it was said with clarity. The confrontation didn't escalate because there was nothing left to argue about. He didn't deny what had happened. He didn't minimize it. He didn't ask for forgiveness, not directly. Instead, he asked, what happens now? That question mattered more than any apology could have. I'm going to make decisions based on what's real, I said, not what's convenient. He nodded, slowly. as if that was something he could finally understand. There was a pause then, a long one, the kind that doesn't beg to be filled. "I'm sorry," he said eventually. I believed him, but belief doesn't equal restoration. "I know," I replied. And that was it. No shouting, no accusations, no recounting of evidence. The truth didn't need to be proven. It had already reshaped everything around us. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with recognition. He recognized that the version of me he had underestimated no longer existed. And I recognized that I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. We sat there a while longer, two people acknowledging the end of a shared illusion. Then I stood up, poured the coffee down the sink, and began clearing the table. Life, in its quiet way, was moving forward. I didn't reinvent myself after everything ended. That's the part people often expect. The dramatic transformation, the sharp edges, the visible armor. But I didn't become harder. I became clearer. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. It's a return to something I had quietly set aside. In the weeks that followed, my life simplified, not because things were easy, but because they were no longer divided. I didn't have to translate my instincts into something more palatable. I didn't have to doubt what I noticed or soften what I understood. I trusted myself again. That trust changed how I moved through the world. At work, I spoke when I had something to say and stopped explaining myself afterward. I didn't seek validation for my conclusions. I presented them calmly and let them stand. People responded differently to that version of me, not with fear or resistance, but with respect. Not because I was louder, because I was precise. In my personal life, I stopped performing emotional availability on demand. I chose where to invest my energy instead of offering it by default. Some relationships deepened, others faded quietly. That didn't feel like a loss, it felt like alignment. I learned that being easy is not the same as being strong, and that strength doesn't require rigidity. It requires boundaries that don't need defending because they're consistently honored. I don't carry bitterness toward my husband. That surprises people too. Bitterness would imply that I'm still negotiating with the past. I'm not. What I carry instead is understanding, not just of what he did, but of how easily people confuse silence with consent, and how often women are rewarded for making themselves legible rather than formidable. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. I still value peace. I still prefer restraint over spectacle. But my restraint is no longer an invitation to overlook me. It's a choice I make when it serves me, not when it serves someone else's comfort. The experience taught me something essential about power. Power doesn't always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as the ability to wait without shrinking, to observe without internalizing blame, to act without needing permission. I didn't win, I concluded. And conclusions have a quiet dignity to them. When I look back now, I don't wish I had spoken sooner. Not because I regret silence, but because I understand it. That silence wasn't weakness. It was the process through which I learned exactly who I was dealing with and who I needed to become. I am more careful now, but not closed. More discerning, but not cynical. I trust slowly, but fully when trust is earned. Most importantly, I no longer make myself smaller to preserve someone else's illusion of stability. If there's a version of me that survived this, it's not the one who endured quietly. It's the one who recognized that endurance is only meaningful when it leads somewhere. And I know where I'm going now, not towards something dramatic, not away from something painful, just forward with my eyes open. There's a reason I wanted to tell this story from beginning to end. without skipping the quiet parts. Because most betrayals don't begin with cruelty. They begin with an assumption. The assumption that someone will always adapt. The assumption that silence equals safety. The assumption that if there's no confrontation, there's no cost. What this experience taught me is that emotional justice doesn't always look like exposure or punishment. Sometimes it looks like alignment between what is true and what is allowed to continue. I didn't reclaim my power by humiliating anyone. I reclaimed it by refusing to carry a version of reality that wasn't accurate. There's a subtle but important difference. For a long time, I believed being patient meant being virtuous, that being understanding meant being evolved, that staying calm meant being strong. Now I understand something more precise. Patience without boundaries becomes permission. Understanding without accountability becomes erasure. Calm without clarity becomes invisibility. The moral of this story isn't be suspicious. It isn't never trust. And it certainly isn't wait silently until someone collapses. The moral is this: pay attention to who benefits from your silence. If your quiet consistently protects someone else's comfort at the expense of your clarity, it isn't peace, it's postponement. And postponement always collects interest. What ultimately ended my marriage wasn't a single lie or even the affair itself. It was the sustained belief that I would continue to absorb what I noticed without ever acting on it. That belief shaped every choice that followed. When that belief turned out to be wrong, the system adjusted. I didn't orchestrate destruction. I stopped maintaining an illusion, and illusions, once unsupported, fall on their own. If you're listening to this and wondering whether you waited too long, or stayed too quiet, or trusted too deeply, let me offer you this gently. You weren't wrong for believing in the best of someone, but you're allowed to stop believing when evidence asks you to. Awareness isn't betrayal. Documentation isn't cruelty. And choosing yourself doesn't require anger to be legitimate. Some endings don't need drama. They need honesty and the courage to let consequences exist without softening them. I didn't leave this story with triumph. I left it with self-respect. And that, I've learned, is a much quieter and more durable form of dominance. Before we end, I want to ask you something, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated because you stayed calm? And if so, what did it cost you to stay that way? If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. And if it unsettled you a little, that's okay too. Some truths are meant to do that.